Hey guys, it is Solly, your host of Kitchen Table Research, and today we're diving back into the medical mysteries and fatal fatal familial insomnia. And so the last video we talked about the doctor. So let's get back into this family and see what happens as time goes by. So now I'm reading from the New York Times article by William Grimes called Tracing the Strange History of a Family with a Mysterious Incurable Disease. And I'm kind of taking snippets from this and snippets from different podcasts and what I know from my medical experience to kind of add into this article, okay? So for more than 2 centuries, a strange incurable disease has haunted a family in the Veneto region of Italy, so in the Venice area. It signals its appearance when the victim, an otherwise healthy adult, begins holding his head stiffly and sweating profusely, which we talked about in our last video. The pupils contract to pinpoint size, pulses race, and blood pressure shoots up. Sleep becomes an impossibility. After the victim suffers from these, for around a year to 15 months, the patient will then slip into a coma-like state and then pass away. Until quite recently, doctors and medical researchers were simply baffled by this disorder, which affected about 40 families worldwide. So there's very few case studies, even going back as far as the 18th century. Today, fatal familial insomnia, as it was named in 1986, is believed by many researchers to belong to the same class of disorders as mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and chronic wasting disease, which we talked about when we talked about prions. And its peculiarities may well shed light on neurodegenerative and neuromuscular diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which we talked about. So there is a really great book about this family by an author named D.T. Max. It's called The Family That Could Not Sleep. So he tried to decode what happened to this family. So we talked about the first known victim, the doctor, in our last video, but in this article it says many descendants well into the 20th century would have their diseases misdiagnosed as meningitis, encephalitis, pellagra, which is what they said the doctor passed from, alcoholism, hypertension, depression, anxiety, and a host of other illnesses. Since the chances that a patient will pass the disease to a child are 1 in 2, so 50%, the mortality rate for this family was and remains appalling. So if we go back to the 18th century, back to the doctor, how did he acquire this disease to begin with? It's not really known, but these are some of the theories. So as we talked about in our prion video, scrappy is a prion disease that occurs in sheep. Well, at this time, due to droughts and other things like that, to keep livestock living, what a lot of farmers would do, and still to this day, this is how mad cow disease and other prion diseases get passed down, is from this one species eating its own species. So for instance, with sheep farming and scrapie, what they were doing is any remains that were not sold as like meat or good cuts of meat, including the brain, which is where the prion disease lives, it would be ground into mill and re-fed to the sheep. They do the same thing with cows. They will grind up bones and other pieces of the carcass that are unusable, including most of the time the brain, until we figured out prion diseases in the 80s. And they would feed this mill, so they would feed cows cow mill, or sheep mill. And this is one of the ways that prion diseases get passed, as we mentioned, is eating the brain of the same species that carries a prion disease. That's what turns these proteins into rogue proteins, which are prions. So as Italian sheep researchers and neurologists puzzled over the unfortunate descendants of this Venetian doctor, we go back to New Guinea, where they started to study Kuru. And of course, the 4 tribe called this, quote unquote, the Laughing Death. So we already talked about Kuru, so you guys already know about that. So now as we move into more current day into 1980s, scientists for hundreds of years have been fascinated by this and could not figure out how this genetic mutation was even happening in the first place, and then how it was getting passed down through some of these case studies of the family. But this Venetian family is one of the most famous families because it was like every single member of the family contracted the prion disease. And so the family thought that they were cursed by this laughing disease or this fatal familial insomnia, although that's not what they called it at the time. So, for members of the Italian family, the disease remained an infuriatingly ambiguous death sentence, a killer sadistically biding its time. A family member named Assunta stepped down from the bus one day and felt a shock that traveled from the top of her head to her feet, quote unquote, a sizzling in her entire nervous system. A brief dizzy spell followed. It was the beginning of the end. After about 6 months, this woman only weighed about 75 pounds, Assunta, and could no longer swallow. Unfortunately, she was unalived by choking on her own saliva. Another woman named Silvano is especially poignant. A debonair playboy, he broke out in a profuse sweat on a cruise in 1983 when he was only 53. His decline was rapid, although he continued to wear black silk pajamas with pocket squares and receive visitors at the hospital. And you have to remember, sweating is one of the major symptoms of this illness. Quote unquote, in the last few days of his life, he was just laying there in a twitch, exhausted nothingness. So, the narrative moves into the present, and disorders like mad cow disease and chronic wasting disease loom larger. So scientists are now kind of starting to understand how these diseases works. But unfortunately, this Italian family still wrestles with its curse. However, there is another woman by the name of Sonia Valaba, and she became a scientist, and she was part of this family. So in the next video, we're going to get into Sonia and how her and some of her family members and colleagues were able to figure out this disease and how to stop it. And as we know, you cannot cure prion diseases. And so, as I stated, next time we will get into Sonia and her work and her passing with fatal familial insomnia. But really quickly, before we do that, let's talk about fatal insomnia for a minute. So just reading off of Wikipedia, fatal insomnia is an extremely rare neurodegenerative prion disease that results in trouble sleeping as its hallmark symptom. The cases are familiar, stemming from a mutation in the PRNP gene, which is a protein gene, with the remainder of cases occurring sporadically, which is called sporadic fatal insomnia, or SFI. The problems with sleep typically start out gradually and worsen over time. Eventually, the patient will succumb to total insomnia, most often leading to other symptoms such as speech, coordination problems, dementia. It results in the unaliving within a few months to a year, and there is no known disease-modifying treatment. So, like I said, some of the symptoms are characterized by worsening insomnia, panic attacks, paranoia, phobias, hallucinations, which increase the panic attacks. Those continue for about 5 months. Then complete inability to sleep is followed by rapid weight loss. This stage lasts for only about 3 months. Then the final stage is dementia, during which the person becomes unresponsive or mute over the course of 6 months. That's the final stage of the disease, which then the patient is then unalived by the prion disease. So we kind of already talked about prion diseases. So as I stated in our next video, we'll get into Sonia and her work. All right, you guys have an excellent day. Much love. Soli.